say that.
Well,
right. Well, yeah, go ahead,
Shannon,
Mike.
are you talking about, theologians and philosophers, theist philosophers of religion? Because I honestly don't think that the average believer could cite evidence or arguments for why they believe in God. Clearly, you believe you have evidence. I've heard it. I've heard a lot about what you see as evidence for the belief in God. So, and I'm sure that most, theist philosophers and believers who study the rationality of belief, yeah, they have evidence. They're not proponents of believing without evidence, that type of faith. But I mean, you probably know more believers than I do, but I have known many believers in my time. And I feel like a lot of them, when I ask them, why do you believe in God? It comes down to, I just have faith. Maybe that's just my experience, or maybe a skewed sample. I'm really curious though, if you genuinely feel that if you ask the average believer on the street randomly, a random theist, why do you believe in God? Are they going to say, oh, well, because of this argument and this argument and this argument and this evidence and this logic? Or are they going to say, I have faith, and not really have arguments or evidence? What do you really think, Shandon?
Well, I'm not saying that those encounters aren't real, where folks will say, I just believe. And I acknowledged that early on in this episode. What I'm doing is I'm suggesting that if you were to probe deeper, I suspect their response would be a matter of not being sophisticated enough to frame how they came to believe, their grounding or their foundation, as it were. For example, if somebody said, you ask them, why do you believe in God and why do you believe in Christianity? Oh, I just do. I just believe. And if you walk away at that moment, you might get that impression. But if you press further, they might follow that up with something, again, unsophisticated, but on point, which would be, well, nature is very interesting and beautiful, and I just don't think that would be a cosmic accident. And so it seems to scream God to me, So they might give an unsophisticated but reasonable response. Others might say even something that sounds bad. They might say something like, I only believe really because that's what my parents believe. But if you think about it, they're adopting a form of reliable testimony, as it were. They're assuming what their parents say is generally reliable, and they're inferring this particular claim to be amidst all the other claims that are momentous. And since they've been right all along, they're inductively likely to be right here. Again, you don't have to like the argument. It doesn't have to be good. But I think a lot of people at the end of the day are more willing to ground it in something rather than just literally say, I know the evidence is completely against my beliefs, but nevertheless, I hold it. In fact, I think if you framed your question that way, you'd get a much different response.
I don't think many believers would say, I know the evidence is against it, but I choose to believe. But what I'm saying is that they're either, at least in my experience, for the most part, going to say, I believe because I'll give you some of the answers that I've heard. I believe because I don't like the idea that nothing happens after I die, or I want to see my loved ones again in the afterlife, or there has to be some form of cosmic justice for all the suffering in the world. Essentially, they have pragmatic or emotional reasons for believing. And now if you're going to go ahead and say that, well, even if they have a reason such as, well, it's because my parents taught me it and generally things they taught me were true. If you're going to count that in the side of believers with evidence, I'm gonna say that's not fair, because that is not evidence of any sort. That's not an argument of any sort. That's actually really faulty reasoning. That is no better of an answer than I believe because it makes me feel good. It's no better. It's different. It's different, but certainly not better. It's they both completely lack any sort of logic, reasoning, or evidence. It's essentially just the same as saying, I have faith.
Yeah, all forms of sort of wishful thinking constructs aren't evidence at all. You can't say the God hypothesis is more probable given that I really, really hope that I have eternal life. Obviously, nobody thinks that that's a reasonable position. I think when folks will say something like that, to their credit, being charitable here, is they're taking a sort of Pascalian approach, sort of a Blaise Pascal approach, this implied understanding that the evidence doesn't really point either way, but I have to make a decision because no decision is a decision. Kind of like standing on the railroad tracks and you're unaware of whether there's an oncoming train. So the question is, do you move? And if you may have no evidence one way or the other, supposedly, in which case you might say the risk of staying outweighs any reward. And so a risk reward calculation drives you to get out of the way. And if someone is thinking along those lines, like, I don't know, the evidence could go either way. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. But because I really, really want to be on the right side, I don't want to give up eternity, then as William James said, I'm going to engage in the will to believe, precisely because this is a significant decision to make. So it's an existential argument. Is it a good one? Not by itself, but I think it's rational if the evidence in fact is 50-50 or difficult to adjudicate.
Yeah, but in reality, considering the vast numbers of religions, all of which, or almost all of which, say that if you don't believe in that one true God, you get hit by the train, you go to hell. It's really not a matter of whether to stay on the train tracks or get off. It's a matter of, stepping off of these train tracks and onto another one. And it's all tracks. It's all tracks. You know what I mean? So I cannot believe that these absolutely, illogical, baseless arguments or reasons count as evidence. That they don't. It really just comes down to faith. If your argument is some sort of Pascal's wager type argument that is so erroneous that I don't count that as anything but faith.
Well, again, that's more generic. Pascal's not framing it in terms of world religions and interpretations of God. He's framing it in terms of God or no God. And so it's construed in a binary fashion. I think when it comes to taking into account the numerous interpretations of God, that is a different matter altogether. And I'm not defending that is reason, or that is a good argument for being a Christian. All I'm saying is that's not the same thing as saying I believe and to heck with the evidence. That's not the same thing. If someone has a Pascalian kind of argument and you want to point out the flaws of that approach vis-a-vis world religions or whatever, then what you're doing is you're showing their argument to be defective, not that there's no argument. But the threshold here is very small. We're just wondering, is their faith just ridiculous and had without any consideration of reason? And I think we have to say that even a Pascalian person is attempting some matter of reason they find convincing, flawed or not.
I'll grant that. It's better than saying I believe because it makes me happy. Fair. If someone were to present a Pascalian argument, you're right. You can consider it some form of reasoning, which is better than none. Obviously, I mean, here's the thing. I know there are arguments for believing in God. I know there have been attempts to make belief in God logical and reasonable. Of course, I'm aware of those. I think they all fail. So that's the thing. I would still rather, have a believer who at least knows the arguments, at least, they think that they have evidence, and that those arguments are sound and justify a reasonable belief in a creator. I would rather have that. So fair enough, I'll grant that. I guess I shouldn't just dismiss some sort of weak Pascalian reasoning, because if I do that, then I'm basically dismissing all reasoning for believing in God, which of course I do personally. But I'll grant that I'd rather have that type of person. I think that type of person is essentially at least thinking about it more deeply and thoughtfully. So it's better. It's a better form of believer in my mind.
Just got off the clock, just got on my chill. Called on my homie Brent to see what be the deal. What you trying to do? I'm just trying to heal. Hella floated, never bloated's what I'm trying to feel. Hop in the whip and